Hey there, folks. It's Jay Frost speaking to you from Command Central at the Philanthropy Mastermind series back here in Virginia, and happy to welcome you back to the series. Really a pleasure to have people back in this room. We took a week off to go up to the Giving Institute, which was a real pleasure, and we can talk about that on a future occasion. It's going to be a busy few weeks now as we prepare, of course, for everything from Giving Tuesday through the end of year fundraising and everything else that we do at our organization. So I'm really glad you could spend a few minutes here with us as we dive into the busiest season of giving. And this is going to be a fun session that we're going to have today with our guest, Sherry Chaney-Jones, who is of course, the president and CEO of Sure Impact. And I'll be showing you her face and introducing her in just a moment to you. But first, I want to welcome you and also want to thank our sponsor for everything we do here and have been doing since way back in 2016, and that's DonorSearch. So if you want to know more about DonorSearch, unless Sherry mentions them to you in her presentation, we won't be talking about them much today. But that doesn't mean we don't want you to know about their work. They do tremendous work in the area of understanding our donors, both present and future. So if you care about your donors, and I sure hope you do, especially at this time of the year, go check them out at donorsearch.net. And while you're there, you can not only learn a lot about the people who love what you love and support your mission, but you can also see the entirety of the Philanthropy Mastermind series there under the Resources tab. And in fact, we also now have some social channels as well for the series. So I hope you'll check all of those out. But with that, I want to turn over the mic very quickly to Sherry Chaney-Jones, who's a thought leader in this space, dealing, of course, with the impact-driven stories, which are the bread and butter. That's a terrible analogy. They're really everything. They're more like the turkey and gravy of what we do in philanthropy. So Sherry, thank you so much for hanging out today. And I see that you're on mute, so you're going to want to unmute and say hello.
Hello, everyone. Thanks, Jay.
Thank you so much for doing this today. I'll sit back and let you weave a little magic.
Awesome. Well, good day to everyone, wherever you're joining us from in the world. I'm really excited to be here today to talk to you brilliant fundraisers on how to use data-driven impact stories to increase funding and donor engagement. I think, well, and I'll share with you in our presentation how impact measurement is the secret sauce that maybe you're not utilizing as much as you can, and how to get your colleagues within your nonprofit to help you have data-driven impact stories to raise more money. As Jay mentioned, I am the president and founder of Sure Impact. I have a 20-year plus career as a program evaluator. I have been a government funder. I was a government funder for 10 years, then launched a consulting company to help nonprofits gather and collect data to change action outcomes in lives, and realized that technology was a barrier to being able to attract their data. I'm just curious if you wouldn't mind going into the chat and just answering this question for us. And that is, what data does your organization use in its impact statements? Do you use any data? Do you have stories of outcomes? Are you qualitative, quantitative? Just curious, when you hear, impact statements, how do you define that currently? It will help me level set and understand, where everyone is joining from today in terms of their use of impact measurement. So we've got donors, amounts, volunteer hours. Okay, people served, outcome stats. Oh, nice. We've got one that doesn't use data, statistics, donor impact stories. Qualitative and qualitative. Good, Mary. Number of projects completed, dollars invested, client satisfaction. This is great. So what I'm hearing from those of you who are joining into the chat here, we have a variety of different definitions of when we hear about impact statements, what we're actually sharing, whether it's qualitative stats, fundraising dollars, impact story. So a lot of different ideas here. So today we'll have a framework that will help us all think about, what am I talking about, and what really drives and moves donors to want to engage within your nonprofits and in your work. So let's put ourselves in as a donor here, whether we're a individual giver or a foundation or a government donor, investor, and we have these two stories of impact. The first is our outputs only statement. And this is, you share your information, you say, we provide recreational youth services to 100 underprivileged youth. That sounds great. Or we could swap 100 to 1,000 or 100,000. But regardless of how many people we put in there, that is an output only statement. It just tells us basically what we did and who we served, versus an outcomes-based impact statement, where you're sharing that through recreational programs serving 100 youth, you improve their reading comprehension by 2 grade levels. You kept 99% of at-risk youth served in school and 100% out of the juvenile justice system. And for every $500 donated, the lifetime earning potential of one child is increased by $289,000, which is a 57,777% return on your investment. Now, of course, this is a rhetorical statement. Which program would you fund? It is a no-brainer. Obviously, the funder, of all things else being equal, would be attracted to the nonprofit that was able to talk about their impact through an outcomes-based impact statement versus just sharing the number of people served. And we're going to talk about how do you get your organization to in a place where they can share this outcomes-based impact statement. And don't just take my word for it. I've studied this work, like I said, for 2 decades now. But back in 2014, I published Impact and Excellence, where it really drives down what is motivating organizations and nonprofits in order to have these high-performing measurement cultures that are creating more impact and are raising more money. And what I found was there are 3 types of nonprofits. The first type do have impact and outcomes data, like I just shared in that example, and they're using it strategically to make decisions. We have our outputs only nonprofits that have outputs, they can quantify how many people they serve. They might be able to quantify how many services they provided to their beneficiaries. And then we have nonprofits that aren't really tracking any data outside of financial data, nothing related to their services and the results of those services. And so we had these 3 types of nonprofits. And what we did is we looked at what kind of organizational results were those nonprofits achieving. And these are the things that your board, your leadership, your staff, yourself included, are trying to do every single day. And so as you can see, and how you would read this slide if you're following along with the slides, is that our purple bars are those nonprofits that had that impact and outcomes data, and we're sharing it and using it as part of their work. And across the board, our purple organizations, our outcomes and impact organizations, were significantly more likely to achieve these organizational outcomes compared to the outputs only and the no data organizations. And so look at increased revenues there. 62% of our impact and outcomes organizations had increased revenues versus 18% of outputs only and 12% of no data. So if your organization is only collecting outputs or only sharing outputs data, you are very similar to those who aren't collecting any data at all in terms of opportunities to increase revenues. And when you change and start to add that impact and outcomes data, that's when you'll start to see significant increases in your revenue. This is the hidden secret sauce that very few, I think, fundraisers, they might know this, but trying to help them get to that place. And I want to share a story with you today of Dr. Tracy Perryman, the CEO of Center of Hope up in Toledo, Ohio, and how they were able to transform their organizational culture to significantly raise more money for their program, so much so that they just now opened a brand new facility for their students. And a lot of that was because of their ability to tell their impact story. They started to collect outcomes related to their academics, so how their students were improving proficiency in math and reading. They were also looking at workforce development outcomes, being able to meet their families with their basic needs. And because they were able to calculate this and tell their social return on investment, they received a significant change in their organization. So here's some of the stories that the Center of Hope is able to tell because of their outcomes and impact data. they learned that 63% of their participants achieve their desired outcomes. Now, you and I, we can debate if 63% is good or bad, but they took the efforts to measure. And so in the school programs and the after school programs, they were looking at academic outcomes, and the workforce development programs, they were looking at job placements, but across all of their different programs, on average, 63% of their clients achieve that successful outcome. Then what they were able to do was to calculate how much it cost to get one person to that successful outcome. And we'll talk more about that cost per success measure in a minute. And then they went even further to calculate how much in community savings did they generate when they got one person to a successful outcome, which allowed them to start talking about their social return on investment, and how if funders gave them $2,373, that they would be generating $16,000 in community benefit. And this story, this data, this information is what helped transform their nonprofit organization. They also started to transform the culture of the whole entire community, because as they were going in to tell their story to different funders, the funders were turning around to, the other nonprofits coming to them asking for money, saying, well, what's your success rate? What's your cost per success? What is your social return on investment? And those other nonprofits weren't prepared to answer those questions. And so we need data to tell more powerful stories when we're talking to our funders, that our funders are the next generation of donors. I don't need to tell this audience the transfer of wealth that's going to be occurring over the next decade or so. And that wealth is not committed. Just because a senior has chosen to donate or be an annual giver to a certain cause, when that money is transferred, it does not mean that that next generation is also going to continue to give to that organization. And what we know about these next wave of donors, they want to be portals of purpose. They want to be their engines of impact, and having those powerful stories lets them know how, when they invest in you, they are being part of that engines of impact. So as we think about creating these impact-centric nonprofits that are able to tell these outputs and impact statements, we have to convince the rest of our organization why we need to prioritize this. So our advice is, again, start with the end in mind. That's why I started with the slide related to the outcomes that organizations are experiencing when they have outcomes and impact data, because it is evidence that when you have this information, you include this in your stories, you're able to increase funding. You're also going to ensure that you're improving the results of your beneficiaries, because if your programs aren't as effective as you want them to be, like the Center of Hope example, when they were 63% successful, well, now they have a baseline, they have a benchmark to say, you know what, that's good. We're grateful that we're moving the needle for 63% of our participants, but we want to be 80% successful. And so now they have a place to start. They have data they can use to help improve that. And then they tell that story as they improve. And it also is going to bolster your impact story. So we definitely need to start in the end of mind. So let's think about, how are we going to move our organization to this place? Because I recognize, and as we noticed in the chat at the beginning, is that many of you are this is a journey, and you're on a different place on your journey. So let's walk through what steps you need to take in order to get to that ultimate goal, like Center of Hope, to be able to tell that social return on investment impact statement story. So first and foremost, and this is probably where DonorSearch can help you as well, is make sure your goals are aligned with your funders' goals. Make sure that the outcomes that you're measuring or achieving are aligned with the outcomes and the desires and the interests of your donors. And if they're not, then don't, it's not about chasing the metrics that your donors are looking for. It's about aligning your work with the donors who are already interested in the results that you are achieving. So that's first and foremost. Just make sure that you have alignment between the outcomes that your nonprofit is producing and the outcomes that that donor wants to invest in. Then we want to have a very strong theory of change, which communicates how your nonprofit is the absolute best in its community or in its geographical area or the service area in which you serve to solve a problem. You want to be able to identify with data that there is a problem in your community, it's a data-driven problem, and that your nonprofit is effective and the best organization, and it can't be solved in a for-profit world to achieve these results. And you need to be showing outcomes, not just outputs when you're telling that story. And so then once you've kind of committed to these three things, we need to prioritize data collection within our nonprofit. So you as the fundraiser has this information when you need it to go out and tell your story. We obviously, collecting data is one thing, but we need to make sure we're analyzing it so we can tell how people are better off. And then once we do that, we can start to communicate it and incorporate it in our strong impact statement. And I always like to share this journey because it helps us understand that it is a journey and that there are steps we need to take in order to get to that place where we can truly be a change maker in our community, but also stand out as the leader and the change maker in our community. So let's talk briefly about these different steps and what we want to think about in each of them. So first, we want to make sure that our goals are aligned with our funders' goals. So before you write a grant or before you pitch a funder, make sure you understand that particular donor's thesis. Most donors do have, especially the larger donors, they do have a thesis. They do have an investment, and when I say investment, I mean a donation thesis related to what causes are they interested, what problems in the community are they looking to see changed. And so, you can look at what other causes they've invested in if they don't have it specifically written on their, on their mission statements or out there publicly, and ask yourself, do your goals align with theirs? And if your goals do not align with theirs, if your outcomes are outside of and what you track are outside of what they're interested in, then find another donor. Don't go chasing theirs, because that's when nonprofits get really out of whack, is when they start chasing the money and they follow the metrics with that instead of just becoming very clear and saying, this is our mission and this is what we measure. So if you're in a place where you've never measured outcomes before, here is my gift to you. It's the 5 Whys exercise. It is a very powerful exercise. It will help clarify what you should be measuring. It's my go-to. Any nonprofit I talk to that's like, we're not measuring outcomes, where do we start? This is the exercise I make them do. So the 5 Whys exercise is essentially 3 questions that you're going to ask about your organization. And you're going to ask these 3 questions 5 times. So the first is, why do you do what you do? I don't mean you personally as a fundraiser, but I mean your organization. Why does your organization do what it does? Why do you exist? And how you're going to ask this 5 times is you're going to ask yourself, maybe you're a youth development organization. And so why do you do what you do? Well, we want to provide safe spaces for kids. Well, why do you want to provide safe spaces for kids? Well, because when children engage in safe spaces, they have greater learning outcomes. Okay, well, why is it important that children have greater learning outcomes? Well, because then they have a better career opportunities as adults. Why is it important they have better career opportunities as adults? Well, because they have more sustainable communities, thriving lives, whatever those are. But you can see how these whys build on each other. Then you want to ask the same question about your funders and partners and why they want to participate with you. And so when you have, especially if you're looking at foundation funders or looking at more institutional funders, they likely have some larger societal social change things they want to see and what they want to invest in. And sometimes it's related to that return on investment, or it is that wanting to invest in accountable and high performing nonprofits. So ask yourself, why do they want to partner with you? And then third, you want to ask yourself, why do your participants want to participate in your nonprofit? Why, what do they hope to accomplish? Because remember, for the majority of nonprofits, the people you're serving and the outcomes that you're getting for those that you serve are not the ones giving you money, or if they are, they're doing it at a sliding scale or a reduced rate. Because if you didn't need to subsidize your nonprofit with external funds, none of you would be on this webinar. You wouldn't have a job because you wouldn't be needed as a fundraiser, because you would just have a traditional sales model, which is I have a service, you have money, and I give it to you, and we provide it. So you have, those are your three stakeholders, right? You have a mission that your organization is here to achieve. You have your funders who have a mission that they're hoping to accomplish, or results that they're hoping to see in the world with their investments into the nonprofit sector. And then you have your beneficiaries that have their own motivations and goals. And you would think that these would be aligned, but there's subtle realities, often differences between these three. And the more we understand those, then we can make sure that we're measuring things related to those three stakeholders. So when we're communicating, we can communicate the right outcomes to the right stakeholders. Because remember, we can't change anybody's lives if they're not engaging in our nonprofit. And so just focusing on what the funders want and measuring what the funders want does not mean we'll actually be able to change the lives of the people that we serve. So once we do that, we're going to do the 5 whys exercise. And if your organization has not already put together an organization-wide logic model, that is your next step. Your next step is to create a logic model, which is a one piece of paper that communicates to your donors what is unique about your organization, what are your program resources, what makes you different than a nonprofit down the street. You're also going to demonstrate what do you do with those resources, what are your activities or your outputs, what kind of services do you provide. Then you're going to also get very clear about who do you serve, who are the people uniquely, whether it's demographic breakdowns, geographical breakdowns, certain characteristics about the people that you serve. You want to be able to communicate with data and in words, who is your target population, target beneficiary. Then you're going to list your short-term outcomes and your medium-term outcomes. And why we did the 5 whys exercise is because your short and medium-term outcomes are going to be those whys. So that's why we do that 5 whys exercise first, because whatever you said your whys are is actually your outcomes, and it's what you should be measuring to tell your impact story. So here's just another example about the difference between outputs and outcomes. I know often people are like, I've been in trainings like this before, and I've had fundraisers say to me, outputs versus outcomes, who cares? Well, you need to care because your funders care, and it's what generates more resources for your organization. So let's use this example of building a hamburger. Your inputs are the ingredients. So what is it that you have unique to your nonprofit? The activities would be that you make the hamburger. You put all the ingredients together, and output is the number of hamburgers you produced, and the outcomes are the number of people who are now happy and nourished and thriving because of your hamburger. So that's the difference between, basically, if you kind of keep this hamburger analogy in your mind, that outputs is the number of hamburgers you produce, outcomes is the quality of that hamburger, the experience that the people have received. And just because you make a hamburger doesn't let me know is it a good hamburger or a bad hamburger. Does it achieve our goals? So that's what outcomes are for your nonprofit. Now, I also want to spend some time talking about the difference between short, intermediate, and long-term outcomes, and what your nonprofit should be tracking and looking at, and what you don't necessarily need to be looking at on a regular basis. But you, at a minimum, should be tracking short and medium-term outcomes. Short-term outcomes is what happens immediately after your nonprofit interacts with your clients or your beneficiaries. So if you have a one-day program, then a short-term outcome is what happens after that one-day program. If you have a 6-month program, your short-term outcomes are what happens to a beneficiary after a 6-month engagement with your nonprofit. So don't think necessarily in time, because time is going to be different based on your intervention, based on the offerings that your nonprofit provides. So short-term outcomes are what happens immediately after contact with a client. So go back to your whys and ask yourself, which of our whys are things that we have a lot of control over? We can design our curriculum, we can design our services, we can design, our program design, so that those short-term outcomes are going to happen for the majority of the people that we work with. And when I say majority, I mean 95 to 100%, like that type of control over achieving those short-term outcomes. Intermediate outcomes are things you will have a little less control over, because this is the social change that's going to happen on an individual level when an individual goes out into the world and they're applying that new knowledge, that new learning, that new skill, that new awareness, that new access, right? When they have this immediate outcome, now they're going to go into the world and something is going to be different because of their new behaviors. Typically it's behaviors, or it could be, increased income, or it could be, reduction in certain health risk factors. So now they have more vibrancy or wellness. Now, long-term outcomes are what is going to happen when you serve a lot of people over a lot of times. So now you're starting to get to scale. You're serving a lot of people whose lives are changed, and then they're going out and participating in new behaviors, which is changing the ripple effect around them, right? And so these are going to be data that you, particularly as a nonprofit, you're not going to track them directly. You're going to rely on publicly available data, census data, other type data to start to see trends in your community. But why it is so important that you focus on your short and medium term outcomes is because that's what you have the most control over. And if, especially if you're in a large city, in a large community, unless you're serving the majority of the people who are dealing with poverty or dealing with affordable housing or dealing with whatever the mission of your nonprofit is, you could be the most highly successful nonprofit and not see significant changes in the population statistics until you get to scale. So that's why it's so important that you can show your donors the impact that you're having with the resources that you have, so that you can attract more of those to get to scale, so that you can finally see those community trends change. So I do have some bad news for you today, and that is that as a fundraiser, impact measurement is a team sport. So you are going to need to work collaboratively with the rest of your organization to get them excited and engaged and on board, and prioritize the data collection once you've identified what are those outcomes and impacts that you need to have at your fingertips in order to better tell your story to raise more money. So the three types of data that you're going to work with your team on collecting so that you can go and tell a powerful impact story are these three types of data. First is demographic data about the people that you're serving, because again, different donors have different desires related to making sure that their investments are with different, interest groups or geographies or population groups. It also allows you to demonstrate you're creating equitable outcomes, which is so important in our current society when we don't have equitable outcomes in a lot of our regions. We also want to be collecting data related to activities and services, and knowing what are we doing with those dollars, and then linking those activities and services to those outcome measures, because the more we understand the relationship between who we serve, what we did with them, and how people in communities are better off, that's when we can start to generate really powerful conversations with our donors on how they are those portals of change with us. So once we have the data, once we've collected this data, then we want to analyze the data to determine how people in communities are better off. So that is essentially the definition of an outcome measure, is that it's telling your story related to how you're making a difference in your community. And in order to get there, we need to analyze our data. So now what I promised to talk about is, how do we communicate our impact? So let's say you went through all of those steps. You collected the right data, you've analyzed that information. Now you want to put it together in a powerful impact statement story that will wow your funders and get people excited to donate to your organization. So here are these examples. They come from Made to Stick, which is a book I love, but it talks about why it is so important that we have both data and stories. So when we're looking at our data, we want to look at what do we have that's unexpected? Can we share some unexpected outcomes? Maybe you have data now that shows that when people start to come into your program, less than 10% of those that you serve are, if you're an affordable housing provider, are able to pay their mortgage or rent, or less than 10% were living in affordable housing, for example. If you go share that with a donor, that might be very startling for them. If they learn that 90% of the population that you serve is struggling with being able to pay for their housing or rent, and we can understand how that would lead someone into homelessness. So if someone is interested in, poverty alleviation and affordable housing, that unexpected outcome might very well pique their interest. But then you might go further and saying, but our program takes that 10% of individuals who are able to afford their housing or rent, and by the time they leave their programs, we now have 85% of our clients are able to sell their mortgage or rent. So now when we're doing that and showing these statistics, we're presenting concrete facts. We're showing the donor that we're serious about our mission, that we're taking this seriously. We are analyzing our data, we're using our data, and now the donor knows, great. They go from 10% to 80%. It's very concrete. I can remember that. I can go tell my friends that. It also increases our credibility. And I know we're in an environment which is a very good environment right now related to trust-based philanthropy. But trust-based philanthropy does not just mean, hey, give us money and there's no accountability. What it means is that you have earned my trust to give you unrestricted dollars to use as you see fit to accomplish the goals in our community, because you have demonstrated to me as the nonprofit, and I'm the donor, you've demonstrated to your donors that they can trust you because you have systems in place, you have data collection in place and tools, you're looking and managing to your outcomes. And so it increases your trust, it increases the credibility of your nonprofit when you share this data. Now, before we, you're throwing things at me because you're like, Sherry, but we need stories. We need, yes. The answer is yes. You do need stories. Absolutely, you need stories. By no means am I telling you to ever get rid of your stories, because stories are so important, because they help obviously they help the donor be emotionally connected to your mission. And so when you tell stories, now you're getting me my emotion. And so as humans, we make decisions with our we make decisions with our emotions, but then we rationalize those decisions with our brains. So we definitely want to use those stories of success aligned with those unexpected outcomes. So if we'll go with this housing example, so we take people from 10% can pay their mortgage or rent to now 85% can pay their mortgage or rent. We probably want to tell a story about one of our participants and what her life was like before she could pay her mortgage or rent, and what her life is like now that she could pay her mortgage or rent, right? Because that story is then aligned with our outcomes that we're talking about. And we want to then share that data in a very aspirational way. And this is where that cost per success comes in, because if we then can tell our donor how much it costs us to get one person to be able to pay their mortgage or rent, now they know how they can engage with us. If it is $5,000 to get one person to a housing stability, now as a donor, I know, wow, okay, if that's a lot of money, but $5,000, I can make that type of impact in one person's life. I can transform that one person's life. Now, it inspires them to give, and you can continue to communicate that to them over the lifetime of their journey with your nonprofits, of how many outcomes they've been able to buy or you've been able to help create because of their donation. So in order to get to that powerful statement, we need the number of clients served, we need those client demographics, our services, and our outcomes. So those are the 4 ingredients we're going to use to tell a compelling impact and outcome statement. So here are some guiding questions for you to ask yourself as you're building those impact statements. So how are people better off because of the services and programs you provide? And can you answer that with data? So what you need is a clearly defined outcome measure. So go to those why statements, pick one of those that is most aligned with your mission, and start tracking that information. Track how many people have achieved that particular outcome. Then we need to talk about the number of people who successfully achieve that outcome. And so that's where, when I talked about Center of Hope, 63% were successful. And then we want to look at how much your program costs. So when we think about, what we hear about all the time with overhead myth, this formula lets us finally get away from this whole overhead conversation. It makes me so excited when I watch nonprofits transform their stories into a cost per success calculation. Because when we look at how much your program costs, you're going to add up everything. You're going to add up your marketing expenses. You're going to add up your overhead expenses. You're going to put everything into this equation, because there's no way we can separate the outcomes that you receive and the funding that you received. We cannot discern that if you didn't have this funding, you wouldn't have gotten those outcomes, because the reality is you spent this much money in your organization to get these outcomes. That's together. And so when you then take a cost per success, you're taking the number of how much it costs to run your whole entire operation divided by the number of successful people. So if you are 60% successful and you serve 100 people, you're only dividing it by 60, not 100. But that's how you can be very transparent about your cost per success. You're saying, look, we're 60% successful right now. So it costs us, this amount of money to get one person to a successful outcome. Now, as you become more successful, as you drive that 60% success up to 75% success up, guess what? Your cost per success will decrease. So it is the only way you can show efficiency without doing more with less. You can actually go and raise more money. You can spend more in your nonprofit. And if you increase your success rate, your cost per success will either stay the same or go down. So it is a liberating way to talk about the success and the impact of your organization. So here's just some different examples. I've thrown a lot out already, but my point in this slide is different impact statements is getting to that percentage of success of those whys. And every nonprofit's going to have maybe a slightly different way they measure it or talk about it, because you're all unique. There are days I wish I could be, the general accounting principal, the CPAs that could come in and say, well, here are the financial metrics that we have to track. In the nonprofit space, it's going to be aligned to your mission and your whys, and that's what you're going to be capturing and communicating. So here's another example, Working Families Success Network. They have a goal to increase economic mobility for clients, to include financial security, to increase credit scores, and long-term improvements in financial capabilities and healthy spending habits. And they were able to tell this kind of impact story. So not only were they able to talk about, how the percentage of clients who are better off, but they linked their data between who they served and how people were better off. So when they go approach funders and when they're telling their story, they have a great story to kind of convince funders to spend more, to donate more with their particular organization. Because they learned the clients who receive multiple services have better outcomes than those who just received one. So again, that's demonstrating why we need more money for our nonprofit, because the more we serve them, more effective we are, the better outcomes we get for our families. They also were able to talk about how multi-year clients increased they were able to have better outcomes, right? It went from $570 for single year clients to $780 increased household income for multi-year clients. So again, this is demonstrating why they need multi-year funding. We all want multi-year funding. It's because if you stay with us longer, we can make better outcomes for our families. Again, showing how more services, they're saving more dollars, more years. And so this is very, very powerful data, and it helps your donor know how they are moving the needle for these families and how exciting it is to be with a data-driven, impactful organization. So in your opportunity, this is the current world. So I understand why you might be where you are, because the old approach to fundraising, and when we think about impact measurement, it's manual, it's time consuming, it's hard to do. And it's one you probably relate to, where you found an opportunity or a funder has asked you, hey, what are your outcomes? What are your measurable results? And then you have to run to your program team and ask them, and they've got to download a bunch of data and try to give you the answer you need. And then if you don't have data, you kind of do some dancing and say, well, this is what we will measure when we get this funding. And then if you do win that opportunity or you do take those funds, now you're scrambling to figure out how you're going to report back. And so that is the old way. That is the manual approach to fundraising. It doesn't work. It is broken. And the good news is, though, we now live in a world where there's technology, and we can use technology to help automate this process for us. So when you leverage technology, then when you find an opportunity, you can log into your impact management software. You can, as the fundraiser, look at your outputs and outcomes. You can write the grant, write the proposal, give the pitch. You can even show the donor your outcomes dashboard if you want. And if you win the grant or the opportunity or the funding, you'll just continue to do what you've already been tracking and just sharing those stories with your funders. And so that's where we are going, and how technology is going to help us automate this and have this information at our fingertips. So I have a very short amount of time with you all today, but I do have everything I shared with you step by step in this ultimate guide to impact measurement. There is no cost to it. I encourage you to take the QR code. We will be following up the slides, so you can go ahead and grab that when you get the follow-up slides as well. But this will be everything I shared with you, plus so much more in terms of how do you collect the right data, share the data with your funders to grow your impact and your revenues. And that's my core presentation today. I'm happy to answer some questions. It looks like we've got some time for questions. So feel free to type those in the chat. And if anyone has asked a question since during the presentation, Jay, I'd love to know that.
No, I think they were just wrapped. And so we had a lot of comments when you first began, Sherry. And first of all, thank you for this, a lot of great content. And you saw that a lot of the responses when you asked people about their impressions about impact statements and how they thought of that, how they defined it. So if you have a question now, anybody, please go ahead and post it here. We'll be sharing those. We do have one from Bobby, who had asked, can you suggest how to track data for performing arts?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so we've worked with a lot of arts organizations, and I'm going to sound like a broken record because I will ask you to do the 5 whys exercise. But sometimes when we think about the 5 whys exercise with the creative arts, oftentimes there is a art form that you want to have a legacy about, right? So I've worked with like the jazz arts group, and they're very much one of their whys is to get new audiences and younger audiences engaged in arts. And so that's something that they started to look at, is how were their different marketing efforts, how were their different programming increasing the diversity in age and in dynamics of those that were coming to their performances. Also, then they thought about their funders. Why did their funders want to fund them? And some, of course, fund the arts because they just want to see how many eyeballs are on the logo in the program or in the announcements. But again, the more you can communicate how you're increasing diverse audiences that are related to that funder, that goes a long way. But they also found that funders were wanting to invest in the arts because of, we need to be very creative. Our workforces need to be more creative. More creative workforces is a 21st century a learning skill. It's very important. And so they implemented a survey of their patrons, of their participants, to look at how their programming inspired creativity. And, they looked at 21st century learning, how they defined creativity, and they asked questions in that way, because that then helped them demonstrate to maybe non-traditional funders who care about something else more tangible than just, brand awareness on programs, to show them, look, when you invest in us, we're increasing the creativity of the future workforce for your employer. So again, the 5 whys exercise is really a key ingredient to figure out how are you going to measure and assess the impact of your work.
And you're just getting a fantastic answer response to that. So thank you. I did want to add something. And if anyone else has a question or a comment, please go ahead and post it now. But Sherry, I wanted to follow up on that. You've mentioned a couple of times about this a desire, a need to demonstrate equity in our work. And I'm wondering if there are any special considerations as people either on the front end gather data that can be used as impact statements, or how they craft those impact statements so that they're sensitive to those issues, both in terms of being able to actually know who they're reaching. So we have diverse audiences, but also then how do they convey that in a way that people can receive it? Because, that's a moving stream, so to speak, as people understand these issues.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I'm happy we're talking about that. And so I think that a few things are responsible to do this. Is that you don't want to ask your patrons or your participants or beneficiaries demographic questions just to ask demographic questions. Like you want to be very thoughtful about why you're asking these questions. And so, for example, if you know that in your community there is an underrepresentation of a certain population in like the arts. So if we're going to go down this theme, if you already know that there is a community that doesn't have access to the arts, and they're representative of your community, that's a good reason to ask that question. And if a patron asks you, why are you asking me for my race? I mean, of course, let them know they don't have to answer, but you can be very honest and transparent and say, part of our mission is to make sure that everyone has equal access to the arts. And the only way, what we focus on grows. And so this will let us know if we're achieving that outcome. But don't just ask questions if you're not going to be thoughtful of how you're going to use them. And then that's another thing. The reason that you're asking these questions should be driven because there is already presented some sort of structural difference or disparate outcome. And then if that is true, and then you're analyzing your outcomes by those different demographic populations, then when you're communicating those back out to your donors, I mean, hopefully we've worked with the Seymour Institute, which is a national foundation, to look at the equitable outcomes their whole network is providing. And they've actually been able to show that in things like housing stability and income stability, they're closing the gap of disparity through their efforts. And so that's a great story to tell. And if you do learn, because sometimes we have worked with customers and they've learned that the outcomes are not equal, that's an opportunity to dig deeper into your data and look at what might be going on. And maybe you need to target your intervention slightly different for different population groups so that you can create equal outcomes.
Right. And thank you for that. And we have a bunch of questions that have come in while we were chatting.
Oh, wow.
And one was a follow-up to your comments about the arts, just asking if you have an example for houses of worship. That also is probably complicated in some ways, but how do you address that? Do you have thoughts?
Yeah. So again, not to just always go back to those 5 whys exercises. And, depending on what your house of worship's kind of mission is or faith is, you may want to be measuring like vibrancy and wellness of your work, or you might be wanting to, I've worked with Christian faith organizations that are very interested in measuring things like, decisions for Christ, or other types of, how engaged are their parishioners in various activities of worship, and how is that translated out into the community. And so again, if you go back to those 3 whys, like, why do you do what you do? Why do your funders, and if your funders are your members in a house of worship, like, why do they want to fund your organization, or be tithes, or members of your organization? And then why they want to come to your organization, that's going to drive your measurement. And that's the most appropriate thing for you to be measuring. So that's where this work is really fun, is because every nonprofit has a different mission, and they're managing to their own outcomes.
Right. And we have another one about yet another mission in a minute, but there was a question in between that I think is kind of interesting. I hope I'm interpreting it correctly. And this is from Francesca, and thank you for that question, Bonnie. This is from Francesca, who asked, when working with a high caseload, what's the best way to disseminate impact information? A postcard, trifold, letter? I mean, maybe it varies, but what are your thoughts about dissemination?
I mean, I feel like dissemination it's the same kind of concept as you would think about it from any sort of marketing perspective, and that is know your how do your donors want to communicate? Where are your donors? So are you communicating it, so if they're on social media, share it on social media, in your newsletter. Like I feel like it's understanding how your donors want to receive that information, and that's how you would communicate to them.
We had a question from Zed, and this is the other slice of the nonprofit pie, so to speak, who had said, we have refugees and immigrants settlement. Let me see. We have a refugees and immigrant settlement nonprofit organization. How do you apply the impact and output there? Do you have any thoughts on that? That must be more complicated in some ways, right?
Some ways. We also work with a lot of immigrant and refugee organizations and help them track their outputs. And it's one of those things that you have to be sensitive to that information. If people, obviously some people would be very hesitant to talk about if they are an immigrant status because they're afraid. But if you can talk about how you're creating equal outcomes for your populations that you serve, it's really about, are you, getting people settled in their community? Are you helping people get jobs? Are they feeling a belongingness and, working? And it really is the same as any other social sector provider, but it's doing it in a culturally responsive way. Understanding, again, why do those participants want to participate with you? Some great measures, especially if you're dealing with different populations, is to measure things like cultural responsiveness. Are you delivering your services in a way that are respectful and meeting the needs of those refugees? Also, your assessment should be in the language and with the first language in which your population speaks, because that's how you're going to get good data. Things like that.
Yeah. Thank you for all of this, Sherry. Really, really great. And thank you everybody for your questions. If you have any more and we didn't get to them, or you haven't had a chance to post them yet, there we go. I was just going to ask you for that. There's Sherry's information. I'll just go ahead and take the liberty of reading it out loud as well for anybody who might be listening to this. And that's Sherry Cheney Jones, of course, CEO and founder at Sure Impact. And so I want to encourage you to take a look at the website as well. You can reach her at sherry@sureimpact.com, and that's SHERI is how you spell Sherry. And Sherry, would you mind going back a couple slides so people can see that QR code again in case people want to look at that? And by the way, Jack, our producer, has put the Sure Impact link in the chat. So if you'd like to click that and be able to take a look at it afterwards, we'd encourage you to do that. You'll find a lot of great resources there, as well as as you can see right on the screen, the ultimate guide to impact measurement. And a couple of folks have asked about a recording of this or access to the slides. And as you might have seen in the chat, those will both be coming your way. There's also some additional information on this the series in its entirety that you're going to see as we close out. So I hope you'll stay tuned for a moment for that. But I just want to thank you, Sherry, for hanging out today and for sharing so much with us. We really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Jay.
It's been great to have you here. This is important stuff because, as you were pointing out, there's so much discussion about overhead, and of course, Dan Pallotta has helped to address that. But you've provided a solution that's very specific, tangible, and even tactical, so our organizations can really make the case that they sometimes find it difficult to make. So, our thanks to Sherry. Our thanks to all of you for hanging out. And we hope you'll join us next time. We have a session coming up next Tuesday that we rescheduled. So please take a look for that. You can find out more about that on the DonorSearch site at donorsearch.net. And also take a look in just one moment for the QR code. You're going to find out a little bit more about DonorSearch and this schedule there. You also see a survey coming up. So please fill that out, will you? So we'll know what you want to see in here as the year comes to a close and we schedule another 80 to 100 sessions next year. And so we'll see you all soon. Till then, take care.